we have started a summer series, thanks, mate, called Influencers, which is really about the way that we can influence those around us, how we can use who we are. All of us have gifts and resources and abilities, and all of us have people around us that we can impact, whose lives we can make a real difference in. And today we're thinking about how we can influence others through generosity. And like I said, to do that, we're in the Old Testament book of Ruth. Now, we don't have enough time to really explore the book, but can I say this? It is wonderful. The book of Ruth is wonderful. I'm actually speaking next week from the book of Esther, which is wonderful as well. And we can't even begin to get into just how wonderful it is. But this is a moment of light. Ruth is just this gem of a book at an incredibly dark time in the history of God's people. Let me tell the story. Don't worry if you've never heard it before. And then we'll focus in on the idea of generosity. All these events take place in a turbulent period of history. It was a time of the judges, and Israel, the people of God, had turned away from him. And we're told that everyone did as they saw fit. They ignored God and they plunged into this repeated cycle of desperation. And it led to chaos across society. And so the story of Ruth opens in a time of famine. There was a breakdown of society. And to escape it, one family moved away to a place called Moab. It was a desperate attempt to try and escape poverty and death. And it must have been desperate because Moab was a sworn enemy of Israel. But in Moab, they end up facing the two very things they try to avoid: poverty and death. They have to sell the ancestral land back in Bethlehem, and they're left with nothing. And then death comes as Naomi's husband and two sons die. So Naomi is left at the very beginning of the story in absolute poverty. And as a woman in this culture, being a widow meant vulnerability, it meant instability, it meant financial insecurity, the constant danger of exploitation. It was a catastrophe, an absolute catastrophe. And she also has two daughters-in-law who've become her dependents, Ruth and Orpah. So she has no security, she has no significance, no future in this culture, others relying on her. And so she decides, I'm going to go back, I'm going to return home. And so, completely empty, she returns to Bethlehem. But before she does that, she says to Ruth and Orpah, she says, "You're young. Stay. Stay in your homeland, remarry." And Orpah does. But famously, Ruth says to Naomi, "No, where you go, I will go. I'm going to come back with you." And they arrive back in Bethlehem and they have to find some way to live. And with no other choice, Ruth does something incredibly courageous. She goes to the harvest fields to glean. And that just means to pick up what was left of the crop, of the grain by the harvesters. It was incredibly dangerous for her. She was open to exploitation, abuse by the largely male workers, and especially as a foreigner from an enemy country, but she goes. And she finds herself gleaning in the fields of a man named Boaz. Now, Boaz is presented to us as a kind, as a noble man, and he's heard what Ruth has done, how she came back to care for Naomi. And he tells his workers to protect her. He says, "I want you to look out for her. More, actually, I want you to leave some extra crops for her." And Ruth comes back home and she tells Naomi all that's happened. And Naomi says, "This is wonderful. Boaz is actually a relation of the family." And it leads to a series of events that eventually, I'm going to spoil the ending if you haven't read it, but still go back and read it this afternoon. A series of events that sees Boaz lifting them out of poverty. He buys back their land. He brings them out of debt. And under his provision and protection, him and Ruth get married, and they are blessed with God giving them a child, a descendant. Like I say, go away, read the whole thing. It's beautiful story. Starts in desperation and despair, but it ends in hope and rejoicing. And it's a story that in some ways hinges around generosity, specifically the generosity of Boaz. And so I just want us to see a few things about generosity from this story this afternoon. I want us to see the power of generosity, the cost of generosity, and then the power for generosity. So the power of, the cost of, and then the power for generosity. Here's the first thing then, short but important, the power of generosity. Generosity moves us. Most of us love stories of generosity. They get attention. And we see it with Boaz. The generosity of Boaz has tremendous power. His generosity completely transforms the life of Ruth and Naomi. I think it's quite hard for us to understand just how fragile they were in this culture. As two widows, any kind of security that they had, any ability to provide for themselves had been lost. And so what you really see in Boaz's act of generosity is not just kindness, it was an act that saved their lives, most probably. So more than just gleaning in the fields as well, in chapter 2 and verse 16, he says to the harvesters, just drop some more for her. And then in chapter 3, verse 15, he makes further gifts of food to them. His generosity sustains them. So there is literal power in generosity. And we could highlight that through so many different stories. Charities that provide for the needs of those in poverty, gifts that raise people out from desperate situations, even small acts of generosity that can change a person's day. But why does generosity do that? Why is there such a power in generosity? Here is why. It's because generosity is an act of love. Think about that. Acts of generosity are always towards others. They benefit someone other than you. And in that sense, they demonstrate love. And when you receive that kind of love, it moves you. It affects you. To experience the love of somebody else like that is a wonderful thing. Growing up, I think I may have mentioned her before, but I had a very generous great aunt. And every time that we would visit her, she would give us money. And every visit to her as a kid was a payday. And so what mattered as a child was that I walked away and I could go to the toy shop. That had a kind of power. To a child, that changed my world. Her generosity changed my situation, but when I got older, I began to appreciate a deeper kind of power. My great aunt never had children, but she loved me and my brother like we were her own. And every act of generosity, this is what I saw, every act of generosity was actually simply an expression of her love. It was an act of love. It expressed a level of care and concern, her very heart. And that was a different kind of power altogether. If you're willing to use your resources for others, if you see that what you have is for the good of others, if you use what you have to bless others, if you're generous, you unleash your power into the world. See, generosity has a power. But that brings us to the next thing, which is the cost of generosity. Because obviously there's a material cost here. To allow people to glean meant that you brought in less of the harvest. And that took away from the bottom line that Boaz had, alongside the other gifts of food as well. All of that meant an economic loss for Boaz. And you know, true generosity of any kind will always cost. Sometimes that's financial. When we use what we have for others, we have less for ourselves. Now, you don't need to be a maths genius to know that that means if you give something away, you have less. You lose it. It's no longer yours. But there are other kinds of costs in generosity as well. And this takes us into one of the lovely plot twists that makes the book of Ruth so wonderful. Because Boaz is a family member. He's related to Naomi, which means, we're told, did you pick up that phrase? He can act as a guardian redeemer. And what does that mean? Again, I've got to be short, but let me try and summarize this. To be a guardian redeemer was a provision that God had made in Jewish law. And it meant that if a family fell into poverty, if they had to sell their ancestral land, God said it could be brought back. It could be bought back. But it had to be redeemed or pulled out of debt by a member of the family. It could be ransomed. But only a member of the family could do that to make sure it was restored back to the family it had initially belonged to. And Boaz is a relative. Ruth happens to be gleaning in his field. He's qualified to do it. But for Boaz to do it would mean an enormous cost. To buy back the land would have been a huge amount of money. But there was more than that, actually. There's another plot twist. Because redeeming the land meant more than simply the soil. It meant that you took on the responsibility of any widows who were attached to the land. That it became your responsibility to bring them into a place of safety and security, which meant if Boaz did this, he would need to marry Ruth. And that meant that what was his would become hers as well. She would share in everything that belonged to him. This act of generosity would change the entire course of Boaz's life. Which is actually, we didn't read it, but in chapter 4, when you go away and read this, there's another family member. One who had a greater claim to the land, another one who could be the guardian redeemer. And Boaz says, listen, I've got to meet with him first, and we've got to talk this through. And he approaches the other one, and the other one says, listen, I'm not doing this. I can't do this. It's too much. He says, if it was the land, I would do it, but not this as well. The cost is just too much for me to bear. So you have immense costs. But there's actually another element here as well, a potentially greater cost than all of those. Think about who Ruth was. We said that she was poor, yes. She was marginalized, yes. But she was an enemy too. She was from Moab. And it's interesting, all the way through, there's a little detail in the story. Every time Ruth is mentioned, she's called the Moabite. Now, that's not just for information, because just once would have been enough then, wouldn't it? You're being told the whole way through, we're being told she is marginalized. She is the enemy. Do not forget that. She is an outsider. So Boaz has to bear all of these costs, the financial costs, the whole course of his life, and then he would join himself to a woman from a despised race. And his reputation could possibly be ruined forever. His standing. You see the cost for Boaz to act as redeemer here? There is always a cost to generosity. And actually, here is a good way to think about generosity. It isn't measured by amount, but by cost. What do I mean? There's this lovely moment in the Gospels where Jesus is teaching the disciples about generosity, and they're in the temple. And they watch rich person after rich person come in and give huge amounts of money. It's a famous story, you probably know it. But then comes in a widow. And as the widow comes in, she puts in 2 copper coins. They are worth virtually nothing. It was almost a meaningless in terms of economic value. But here is what Jesus says in Mark chapter 12 and verse 43. Jesus says, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all that she had to live on. Jesus says, look, see the widow? See the widow? She put in more than everyone else combined. Now, in purely economic accounting terms, that was wrong. But in the terms that really matter, in the terms of biblical generosity, Jesus says hers was worth everything. You see, generosity, it's not about the amount, it's about the cost. So on that basis, see how generous Boaz has been? Boaz takes on the cost. He absorbs the cost financially. He marries Ruth. He shares his wealth. All that he has becomes hers, but he's willing to risk his standing, his reputation, all that cost, but he's willing to pay it. Now, before we kind of move beyond this, You know what this means? One thing this means for us. It means generosity is not just for people with lots of money. Now, see, that's a disappointment to some of you, because immediately you think, well, I'm sure this doesn't apply really to me. I mean, Boaz was loaded. He had lots of money. I have virtually nothing. Well, this is actually wonderful news, because generosity is a willingness to give from whatever we have for the good of others. If you have hardly any financial resources, it doesn't matter. Think about the widow. You can still be generous. You can give of all the other resources that you might have, time and service, encouragements, your gifts, used for the good of other people. This is a wonderful message, actually. But look, this is an inspirational story. But what is this? What is this? Go away, be generous like Boaz? Well, here's the problem with that. It will never work, or at least it might work for a few days. You'll feel inspired by an example. You feel motivated. You may go away and think, yeah, I want to be a generous person. I'm going to go and be generous this week. But then here's what happens. You feel the cost. You feel the cost. And the motivation fades. Here's what you will find. To be generous like this, you need a whole new power. And that's the last thing, the power for generosity. How do we become generous people? How can we unleash the power that generosity has to influence those around us? You got to see three things. Three things, short things. You've got to see the true owner, the true provider, and the true redeemer. Look at this. You've got to see, first of all, the true owner. You know, the act of gleaning was not unique to Boaz. It was actually part of God's law. There's a part in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 22. Here's what it says. When you reap the harvest of your land, this was for everyone who owns land. If you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner residing among you. I am the Lord your God. Landowners were not allowed to harvest to the edges. Boaz was only doing what he was supposed to. Now, why did God do that? Now, part of the reason is exactly as that verse from Leviticus says, is to provide for the vulnerable, to help those who had nothing, actually to help people exactly like Ruth, the poor and the foreigner. But underneath there was something more. Like nearly everything that God said to his people in terms of the laws, it was a message that was about something deeper. And here was the message echoed through the whole Bible. It was that God owns everything. That this is his world. That this is his creation, that those were his fields, and that means he has the rights of ownership over everything. See, here is how we think about generosity. Generosity starts with most of us saying, this belongs to me. What should I give away of what I have? We start with a mindset that says, this is mine, so what shall I give of what belongs to me? You know where the Bible starts? None of it is yours in the first place. Because everything is owned by God. You know what generosity actually is? It's just a call to give away that which isn't ours anyway. Boaz gives of the harvest, but who makes the sun that makes the harvest? God. All that we have is a gift from him. It's exactly as Joe began as we started our time together. James 1 and verse 17. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights. Everything comes down from God as a gift. The truth is, none of us have anything that isn't from God in the first place. Now, maybe you object to that. Maybe you say, well, listen, no, I've worked hard. I've earned all that I have. Well, listen, millions of people work hard all around the world that have nothing to show for it. We work, of course we do. But where we happen to be born, that was nothing to do with us. The relative wealth and stability that we enjoy, that was nothing to do with us. Or maybe you object and say, well, listen, no, my brain's got me to where I am. Well, that's fine. But you had no control over that either. You were just born. They're not your genes. They were given to you. Or maybe you say, well, I worked hard to get educated. Fine, but you simply had opportunities that many other people would have loved to have but didn't. See, our actions are real, but that's another sermon. What we do with what God gives us matters and counts. But everything any one of us has is ultimately a gift from God. You're only being generous with that which doesn't belong to you. You've got to see the true owner of all things, the one who owns the field and gives the harvest. Now that's true, but on its own, it won't make you generous. You got to see the next thing. You got to see the true provider. The generosity that Boaz provides, or the provision rather that comes through his generosity, is amazing. Ruth and Naomi give him food and safety and protection, a home, even a future. But at a key moment in the book, there's a really cryptic statement. It's very strange, actually. Naomi hears from Ruth that she's been gleaning in the field and that a lifeline has been offered. And Naomi says in chapter 2, verse 19, she hears the report back and she says this, where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. The name of the man I worked for today is Boaz, she said. Then listen to verse 20. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. She added, that man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers. Naomi hears the report and she says, we've been shown kindness. But here is the puzzle for Bible scholars. Who is the one showing kindness here? Who is the he in that part of verse 20? Because you read it at first and you think, it's Boaz. That's who's being talked about. He's the he. But the verse, the original language in the Hebrew, it's really ambiguous. It could mean Boaz, but do you know what it could likely is refer to? God. The God who's mentioned at the very beginning of the verse. Right at this core moment where we're told about the provision, there is this question mark. Now you think, what is this? Was this some kind of mistake? Was it just the author being careless? This is no mistake. This is kind of a theologically loaded ambiguity. This is there for a reason. At this key moment, we're not sure who is being the generous one. In other words, we're being given a clue that this is about far more than Boaz and his generosity. This is a hint of what the rest of the Bible makes clear. The true provider, the true generous one, is God himself. And especially when you link it to that word kindness in verse 20, that's a Hebrew word that means more than just being nice. It's a deep, a rich word that means faithful, committed, steadfast love. And significantly, it's the word most often used to describe the love that God shows towards us. See what we're being told? God is the one at work here. He's the one working out all the details so Ruth and Naomi are provided for. Do you think it was by chance Ruth ended up in Boaz's field? Do you think he just happened to be the relative? The point over and over again in the Bible is that God is working the detail. He is the true provider. And you know what? If God is the true provider, here's what it means for us and our generosity. It means we can give generously because we trust God. We can give freely. We can give away at a great cost. We can give away like the widow in the temple in ways that might seem ridiculous to those looking on. Why? Because we know we've got a God who provides for our every need. The true provider. Remember what Jesus promised? He says, seek first the kingdom of God and all these things will be added unto you. He said, listen, you live in this way, God will trust him. He'll provide everything that you need. And don't underestimate either those tiny acts of generosity, those small actions that can be used if God works like this. Boaz acts in just simple, obedient generosity. He let Ruth collect some grain, but do you know what follows from that? You go on. The whole of the book of Ruth finishes with a genealogy, a family tree. And do you know the family tree of Ruth? Do you know where it will end? With the birth of Jesus. Jesus is Ruth's descendant. Boaz's actions mean Ruth becomes part of the line that Jesus comes from. This tiny act can be a link in a chain for God's plans to save the world. Don't ever underestimate the power of God working through your ordinary, everyday, seemingly insignificant actions. What if an act of simple generosity could change the course of something in a way you could not even begin to imagine by doing it? But when God is at work, that's exactly the hope we have. See the true owner, the true provider. The very last thing. To be really generous, you've got to see the true redeemer. Do you remember what Boaz did? He was the redeemer who, out of his generosity, absorbed the debt. He paid the cost. All he had was then transferred to Ruth. Does that sound familiar? You know what? This isn't about Naomi. This isn't about Ruth. This isn't about Boaz either. This is all about the descendant who will come, the true Redeemer to be born in Bethlehem. And what would Jesus do? Out of his generosity, he would absorb the debt, pay the cost, and give everything that was his to us. Here's how the New Testament puts it. 2 Corinthians 5 verse 21. God made him, Jesus, who had no sin, to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Jesus bears our sin, but gives us his righteousness. He pays our debt and then brings us in and unites us with his riches. He takes on our poverty to raise us into his treasure. He sides with his enemies to make us into his friends. To be a Christian is not simply to say, I'm going to go away and try and be more like Boaz or Ruth or Naomi or whoever. It's to say, I throw everything I have on the true Redeemer. And you know, this is where Christianity begins. The first step to generosity is not about giving, it's about receiving. If you're not a Christian, you've got to receive God's generosity. Do you know that? Christianity doesn't begin with a moral campaign. It doesn't begin with a list of things you must do. Faith starts with receiving the most radical gift of generosity the world has ever known, the gift of Jesus. Do you know him? Have you received God's generosity in him? And if you're a Christian, do you see what will make you generous? This is what will transform your heart. Remember, generosity is not about amount, it's about cost. So think about the true Redeemer. Think about Jesus. Think about the cost. He emptied himself. He died for you. He left ultimate riches. He took on ultimate poverty. And when you see that, when it thrills you, when it fills you up, it will change you. And that is the only thing with power enough to make you a generous person. But you have to let that greater generosity move you. Look at the gift until it melts you. Think about Jesus until you become generous, until it captures your heart. Until you say, with the words of the old hymn, thou who was rich, beyond all splendor, all for love's sake, becamest poor. Thrones for a manger did surrender, sapphire paved courts for stable floor. Thou who was rich, beyond all splendor, all for love's sake, becamest poor.